Mike Waddell gave us a ton of lore information today regarding MetaZoo, so let's break it down. Welcome to MetaZoo Recap. My name is Turmentic, and today we are going to look at all of the questions and answers that we got in the lore thread of the MetaZoo Discord today when Mike Waddell was answering all of these lore questions. It was truly amazing. I had to work, so I didn't really get a chance to ask any questions or anything, but looking back through it, there's a lot of information that he gave us, so let's jump right in. The first question is from Rico, and it says, can you explain a bit about how the different blocks will play a role in the lore? Mike says, each block will have 3 books associated with it, and in between the blocks there will be novella comics published with a mini arc. Booyah asks, are the first 6 chapters the first 6 chapters of the upcoming book? And Mike says yes, but they will be heavily edited and some details will change. Now, if you go back and actually watch the interview that I had with Mike a couple of months ago, he actually talks about this, how this was his opportunity of being able to retcon some of the stuff from the actual comics with the actual publication of the book, so I'm really interested to see what some of these changes are. Pellety asks, will Beasties have the ability to communicate with human language without magic? Mike responds with, that depends entirely on how powerful they are, but also on the origin and purpose behind their creation. Next question was, are Beasties conscious? Like, are they self-aware? Mike says, this is a good question, but how would you define consciousness? Most beasties are created by various things, but then again, you could argue humans are as well. The source of creation has very little to do with something's ability to have consciousness. I think we would need to better define with science and magic what allows for consciousness to emerge before this could be answered definitively. Dangerboat asks, will we see things from the story enter our own reality? A box of Gumbaroo O's, mastery badges for each aura type, a Loveland wand, etc. I personally would be super excited to actually see Hodag Hose. That would be straight from the comic. I'd be super excited. Mike says yes, but only because the MetaZoo world is our world. Rico says, will we get backstory on how the main characters from the story acquire their beasties? Like how Rose gets Hodag and Bigfoot, and be told how the magic behind the contracting process works? Mike says yes, and this is hinted at even in Chapter 1 in terms of process. However, some characters join our storyline in the middle of their own journey. We don't get to see their backstory behind how they acquired contracts with certain companions. And he's completely right. In Chapter 1, we actually see not only Adam actually contract the jackalope in front of the school in Chapter 1, but we also actually see the moment that Sam actually contracts Dingbell for the first time in Chapter 2. In my own opinion, I don't know if we'll actually see Rose, for example, contracting Hodag or Bigfoot, because by the time we've actually meet up with Rose in the storyline, she's already been at Quimbley's for 2 or 3 years. She's already been in the field for 6 to 9 months, so she might have already contracted those beasties. Durandal asks, will we get a reason in the universe for why Cosmic is strong against Spirit? Mike says, if most spirits are of our world, it makes sense that they would hold a power over things of this world. But for things outside of it, he leaves that up to interpretation. You Overthink asks, do beasties contracted take on the personality of the caster who contracted them, or do beasties have their own predetermined personalities? Mike says, if the caster is strong enough, the lowest threshold to contracting is the ability to contract. Then comes the ability to not let the contracted beastie control you. Then the ability to control your contracted beastie. Then, for those where the gulf between the caster's power and the beastie's power is sufficiently large, the beastie can take on the aura characteristics of the caster. But then you have to ask yourself, why would such a powerful caster contract a comparably weaker beastie? Now this is interesting because in the past he's actually said that Mothman specifically takes on the aura type of whoever is contracting it. I don't believe that, Mothman to be a weak beastie. Mothman is one of the more powerful in Cryptid Nation, but that gives you the idea of exactly how powerful Indrid Cold is, because Indrid Cold is the one that we think is in the control of Mothman, has it contracted. So if Mothman is taking on the characteristics and the aura type of Indrid Cold, and from what Mike just said, that means that there's a gulf between the actual power level. Then it means that Indrid Cold is ridiculously powerful in this stance. I mean, just because Mothman, we already know, is already such a high caliber that if it is basically, there's a huge difference between its power and Indrid Cold's. Indrid, his power is monstrous. Pelity asks, how many of each beastie can exist? Are there species or just all mutations as the result of some sort of spell? Mike's response to that was, depends on the source and the origin of the beastie. Rat Queen asks, how does a caster form a contract with a beastie? Is it like they hold up their spellbook to the beastie and something else? Mike responds with, contracts are made via a battle of wills. Like all magic in our universe, this willpower can be manifested in certain ways. Some manifest the contract in a spellbook, others as tattoos, others still in various ways that allow them to anchor the idea of the connection. One thing is common across all contracts though, the sigil of the caster appears somewhere on the contracted beastie. And that makes sense because that again has been explained inside of the comic. Sam even makes a joke at one point about how there might be a dark, dusty room somewhere in Unity City that has a copy of all of these different sigils. Sam even goes into depth and actually talks about how there are some nefarious casters that actually carve a sigil onto a beastie, basically to hide their own, in order to like I said, hide their own. They can use it to actually frame a different caster, again, because each one of these sigils is actually unique. I'm very interested to learn more about the sigil lore. Refuge in Shadows asks, does this mean that the wrench is a part of Dingbill and not just a tool he used? And Mike says correct. Pelity asks, is there an afterlife in MetaZoo or a recycling of life essence? What are your plans for doing this in the storylines? Mike responds, there's an afterlife insofar as we know spirits exist with demonstrable evidence post the shattering of the veil. Beyond that and the purpose of the afterlife, who knows? Alex BC asks, how is a caster's sigil formed or decided? Is it based on the aura type that they use, or is it something they choose? I'm assuming they're unique to each caster, but do they ever change if a caster changes personality-wise? Mike says, it's certainly unique to each caster. It's like the signature you put on a legal piece of paper. Some people just know what their signature is, others carefully construct it, but even if they think of what to create, are they just uncovering what it's naturally going to be? What it had to be in the first place? Meaning that a sigil, even if it's a sigil that was carefully crafted and created to be something that you wanted, ultimately probably was going to end up being the sigil that you used, the sigil that your unique calling card, if you will. Rico asks, what is the use for the cryptid cam? Why does Sam take these pictures? To prove that cryptids exist? Like a dex? I'm assuming he was referring to a Pokedex. Mike responds with, hobbies exist. These are people, and even if the world has turned upside down. And again, going back to the comics in chapter 1, Sam talks about the reason why he takes the pictures is he just wants to categorize, he just wants to catalog all of the different cryptids that he actually has seen throughout the town and other things like that. So again, yeah, that's just Sam's hobby, is taking the pictures and documenting what cryptids he actually sees. Wayward asks, will a beastie you contract be transported from where it is at the time you contract it? Mike responds with, the beastie becomes a part of your aura and travels where you travel in the same way your aura does. It manifests where you want it to, but it is still connected to your aura by what you can imagine is an aura leash. This is also how you can break contracts you have with beasties, and how, if someone is talented enough, they can break other people's contracts as well. Now, we actually see 2 instances of a contract being broken by another caster in Chapter 1 and in Chapter 6. M actually releases Mothman from his contract right at the end, right before the door actually closes of the pathways. Love does the same thing with the Crosswick monster. This brings up the question, though, that if M was powerful enough to release Mothman from the contract under Indrid Cold, we are assuming. So does that mean that Indrid Cold was actually near Point Pleasant and able to actually put that Mothman under contract? Because you have to remember that in Chapter 2, once he actually goes to actually talk to the Rainbow Wizard, on the back of the map the Rainbow Wizard uses, there are 6 or 7 towns that look like they've been destroyed. The newspaper, even out in Unity City, had talked about how another city had been attacked. So at that, I'm interested to learn more about that for sure. Refugee in Shadows follows up with, in regard to the statement about someone being talented enough to break someone else's contract, is it based purely on the strength of the given individuals involved, or is there an account for how the contract was formed? For example, forcefully or almost like a team-up like Sam and Dingbell. Like, would it be any harder to break an amicable contract versus a forced? Mike responded with a question. Is it easier to cut a string already under tension? Now, this makes me think that if a contract or a relationship between a caster and a beastie is strained, it would be easier to actually end that. Or if a beastie was contracted and under great duress, it did not like the caster that it was contracted by, or the caster was making the beastie do something it didn't want to do. Again, that would cause tension, like Mike was saying, so it would be, in theory, easier to break that contract. Rico asks, can you tell us more about Sam, his main mission, and some of his goals set out for him? Mike says, it's a good question. I wonder if he has a solid mission. Like most humans his age, heck, even older, they hardly know what they want when they are thrust into the world. A big part of the story is defining his mission. Happy Kitty 05 asks, can multiple casters contract a single beastie? As in, if there is only one Pysaw bird, can multiple casters contract it / have it contracted simultaneously? Mike says, some beasties require exactly this because of the magnitude of their aura. That doesn't mean a stronger caster wouldn't be able to form a contract on their own, though, with a beastie that would normally require 10 casters to form a contract. So he doesn't quite answer if a caster or multiple casters can have a single beastie under contract. He does say that it can take multiple casters to contract a beastie, but that's still a little open to interpretation, because in theory, one of those 10 casters would be the one, I guess, that would be in direct control of it. The other 10, I guess, would have to maintain that contract, though, in order to be able to subdue that beastie, since it's so powerful. But I don't think that all 10 would be able to tell the beastie what to do. I do think there would be one person that pretty much in essence was the handler of that beastie. Wayward asks, are there people who build items to control beasties outside of magic? Maybe do a test on them to transfer power to humans? Mike says, do I need to be able to create electricity with my own fingers in order to harness electrical current to charge my iPhone? Or is a source of power that can be manipulated? Basically go further with this as well too, even in the comics they talk about how dingbells were hunted to almost extinction because of their ability to be able to fix mechanical machines, their ability to generate electricity, to power generators, things of that nature. So 100%, I do think that people would build other devices to control beasties that aren't magical in nature. Pelletty asks, how exactly does Chibi work? For instance, it seems there to only be one Babe the Blue Ox. Does this mean the chibi version only exists in the past? And Mike responds with, a chibi version of a beastie can coexist with its adult form. So he didn't directly say that there are multiple babes, but he did say that there are some beasties that actually can have their chibis in the adult forms side by side. But going off of what was talked about earlier, there are some beasties that are truly one of ones. So in regards to Babe the Blue Ox, I don't know honestly if there would be a chibi babe and a full adult babe next to each other. Rico asks, can you explain what role the Cryptid Busters will play in the lore? Are they the good guys? Mike says, they are simply guys who help others battle rogue beasties. There are many groups like them all over the world with no connection to each other. Think of pest control. Acerbic Arbalist asks, what defines which aura a person or beastie has? Personality? Mike says, like everything else that dictates who we are as human, it's never nature versus nurture, but a combination. There are genetically passed on abilities though, and then there are other abilities that don't have their source in human aura but can still be wielded by humans. What he's talking about here are probably the abstract powers that we see Sam and Adam both have from the comics. This also could be, if M is Merlin, it could also explain Merlin's premonition powers, things of that nature. Wayward then asks, will it be easy to make a contract with a beastie if you want, or will each beastie have its degree of difficulty? Mike responds with, certainly easier to force a contract on a jackalope, which Adam does inside of the comic, versus the Pysaw bird. Andy then jumped in and said, what about, say, a Slide Rock Bolter? And Mike's response was, physical size isn't always an indication of aura size. I would imagine Pysaw Bird is harder to contract despite Slide Rock being many times larger. And Mike then follows up with, unless the Pysaw bird was willing. Even then, since a contract is a fusion of auras, if the Pysaw bird's aura is much greater than your own, you might find yourself under its control instead of vice versa. So one needs to be careful forming contracts with even willing beasties, because willingness to form a contract is not the same as the willingness to hand over control. You can imagine some beasties tricking casters into forming a contract only to take over once it's formed. Immediately, that makes me think of Old Scratch. Mario then says, "Corrupted casters?" ? And Mike responds, "Some casters will do anything for more power, to horrible effect." Streamy Weenie then followed up with, "Interesting, so beasties have their own free will of sorts, and might have their own goals/intentions." Mike responded with, "Some beasties do, yes." Dalton then, trying to help me out, said, "Helping a fellow person ask a question, so forgive me. Was Orange Eyes under control of Indrid Cold?" Mike responds with, "Who knows? But there are more conventional ways to get people, beasties, things to your side without forcing it into a contract. Evil is drawn to evil." Now, this is very interesting just because if Orange Eyes wasn't under contract and Orange Eyes was actually operating by itself, then that brings a whole slew of questions into play right now, along the lines of, that means that Orange Eyes actually had its own spell book. That means Orange Eyes was really casting its own spells. That it brings up a lot of new questions. Fane asks, "To what degree do the sets, Cryptid Nation, Nightfall, Wilderness, UFO, Seance, and Native, follow a chronological order?" And Mike says they don't. It's more block to block. Now, this is huge to me because it doesn't mean that, like he said, it's not a chronological order from beginning to end with that. It means that Nightfall could have happened, and then Seance, and then it could be UFO, then it could be Wilderness. So I'm really excited that I haven't actually finished the timeline video now, because taking that into effect, I need to go back and actually look at the cards and see if they fit a different way now. Really excited about that. Wayward asks, "If a beastie is from, let's say, Lake Superior, will it be possible to find it anywhere else in Cryptid Nation?" Mike responds with, "A beastie will always be more powerful closer to the source of its creation, or at least that was the case before the internet, making the information about them accessible to everyone." Now, this really got me thinking, and it goes into play with some of the other questions later on, but I'm starting to think that the ability of thinking of a beastie, of a cryptid, of things like that, that itself is power, that itself helps in the manifestation of this beastie. And so, like he was saying with the internet, the reason why he brought up the internet was the ease of access of information and the ability for one thing that might be obscured, that might be forgotten, to be remembered, to have more energy put into it because of actually people thinking about it, speaking about it, like writing stuff about it down. That itself is power. So that's a very interesting thought. He did follow up, though, saying that once contracted, though, the connection with the caster is the source of maintaining their power/aura. Rico asks, "Can aura be shared to others? For example, if Sam is low on aura, can he get boosted by his friends? Like, how to train your aura as a human?" Mike responds with, "You can if it's pure aura, but if it has been transformed into another form of aura, trying to boost Sam with frost aura when he has an affinity for flame will just damage him. Almost like blood transfusions. Some talented casters can receive aura, or steal it, not of their affinity to boost their own aura, but they first have to reduce it back down to pure aura." So like he's saying right there, if a lot of people, when they want to try to transfer aura, apparently it would be they would have to break it down to pure aura instead of the aura from the type that's actually coming to them. Like his example was perfect. If Sam has a flame affinity, if you send him frost aura, it's not going to do anything but actually hurt him. Now, this next question was huge to me. Does this mean that the sets also don't have a specific storyline associated with them? I was running under the assumption that we'd have a season block of the show that we'd go through for the story of Wilderness, another for the story of Nightfall, etc. Sounds like it's more going to be along the Cryptid Nation block instead. Mike responds with, "Correct. The sets, other than war, are not connected to the storyline in any organized way. So again, that means that it's not linear. That means that all of these things that we've been seeing in all of these different sets touch on the story, but don't go from part one to the next one. Don't go from one to the other. We could see parts of UFO at the same time as parts of Native, as parts of Nightfall. So that's really, like I said, a really interesting thought process that I'm going to need to look at the cards to actually try to see exactly what that linear storyline would be. Next question was, is neutral aura pure aura? And Mike says correct. Some spells require that you only change a part of the total aura needed to cast it into a certain type of aura. Dalton follows up with, so a Chaos Crystal is extremely powerful. Mike says it's certainly more versatile than the other aurifacts, but one might still want a larger flame aurifact over a pebble of a Chaos Crystal. Pellety asks, how will towers play a role in MetaZoo? Towers are powerful schools of casting that are focused on a particular aura type, Mike responds. And we know that from the comic as well, too. In Chapter 3, when Sam goes to Loveland Castle, we actually meet some of the students from Tower Aguazul, the water casting tower out of Dayton, Ohio. Alex BC asks, is there a part of the world building you've enjoyed more than others, or something you would really like to come back to and spend more time on once the main story is more available or completed? Mike says, you have to start with rules rather than end results. A good rule set will allow you to build the world in interesting and structured ways. If you want an end result or something to happen or make sense that you can't explain with the rules, then you need to adjust the rules. But that becomes dangerous because by adjusting the rules in one way to accommodate something that you want, the impact on the structures you built with the original rule set might fall apart. This is why retconning is such a mess, and a lot of manga-based magic power systems are filled to the brim with contradictions. And this is something, again, that in the interview that I had with him a couple months ago, he talked about. That's why he was excited about the book, because some of the things that he wanted to change a little bit from the comics, writing the book and publishing the book actually gave him that ability of being able to retcon some of the story, because technically the comics aren't going to be the story. The book is going to be the story. Streamy Weenie asks, has aura always existed and people just didn't know how to harness it, or were people just using it secretly? Mike responds with, it was always there. Getting it past the veil, though, only 1 in a million could manifest it in a way that mattered, and even then it was considerably dulled. Layer Worlds asks, can you talk more about what age group the stories will be written for? My kids are excited. Mike says, it will be very similar to the last 3 Harry Potter books in terms of maturity, maybe a little more. It won't be nearly as gruesome as the original 6 chapters were. There were business reasons behind that, but for me the main reason is that I use things like curse words, shock value moments, etc. as a crutch for bad writing. Fane asks, what contains more power, relatively speaking, a caster or their spellbook? Mike responds with, a spellbook is only used to focus the abilities of a caster. Some use spellbooks, some use staffs, some use wands, others don't use anything at all. If you could imagine an apple in your head, the crisp details of its red, the water beating off of it, the way it smells, the mist of juice as you bite into it, do you really need a picture of it in a book to manifest the mental imagery of it? And again, that's something that we talked about in the comics. The Love actually explains to Sam that staffs, wands, books, everything like that, they're just conduits. He even shows the exercise to Sam where he shoots fireworks from his hand, and then he shoots fireworks from his hand while he's holding his staff. He used the same aura both times. It was just the staff allowed it to be multiplied a lot, so it actually had a bigger result. Alex BC asks, any plans to see some non-binary characters in the story world? Mike responds with, non-binary people exist in the real world, so they exist in MetaZoo and by proxy in the books. That being said, many of the characters are more worried about not getting killed or finding the next meal rather than discussing the complexities of sexuality. These books won't be a soapbox for any kind of message. He then follows it up with, I've already introduced 4 people in the LGBTQ spectrum by name in just the first 6 chapters without having to specifically specify it. Pellety asks, in terms of the character design of the human characters, Adam, Sam, and Rose, are those set in stone for the development of your book? Mike says yes, meaning that the art that we actually have so far for them is actually going to be the art for them from the book, animated, the show, things of that nature. We actually found out through Let's Talk MetaZoo when we were talking with Chris that when Chris was actually working on the Atom card for Nightfall, he worked very close with Mike on that, and it's been any of the bigger cards, I would say, that are lore-centric, Beasties, characters, things like that. The artists actually work closely with Mike in order to get that full image of what he has in his head out into the artwork. Rico asks, can you use magic to fly? Mike says, brooms are a thing, yes, but only insofar as using a spellbook to focus intention is a thing. Kesey says, is magic a sentient force? And Mike responds, of course, with, is magic real? Dalton says, how will the new aura wind affect the storyline? Mike responds with, wind and other types of aura are present in the first book. Now that's super exciting because we haven't seen any inclination of wind in the 6 comics. So for wind and other aura types potentially to actually show up in the book, that's really exciting. Rico asks, is there a limit to how many beasties you can contract and summon at once? Mike says, the ability to contract cast in the lore is very similar to the mechanics to how it works in the TCG. If you have enough aura, you can cast and contract more. You can also spend too much and burn out. Dalton asks, how does contracting multiple of the same beasties work? Like 2 Pysaw birds, but different effects. Mike says, if multiple variations of the same beastie exist, it would be no different than seeing a dog walker with 3 dogs on 3 leashes. Helity says, reading this story, how long will it take to understand the rules of magic? Mike says, they don't ever need to be fully understood, only consistent. Some mystery is a good thing. Streamy Weenie asks, do people name their beasties? Mike says, there's power in a name. If I call my Mothman Bob, how strong could my connection to it be as an entity, as an idea? Now, I will say that I read that as him basically saying that the idea of naming something forms a stronger bond, a stronger connection with whatever that entity is. So I honestly think that if you had Bob, Mothman, under your control, and you named it Bob and you called it Bob, that would actually strengthen that connection. Fane asks, is there one Grim Reaper in MetaZoo lore, or does he have a contract to a higher or lower power? Mike responds with, there are certain things that we don't quite understand the rules for. Alex BC says, while Sam's traveling, he stops at a diner somewhere to eat, but that place doesn't seem to be under the protection of a larger city's veil. Are places like that protected by individual casters casting small veils to keep back rogue beasties, spirit storms, etc.? Or are they simply exposed to the greater magic and taking a risk? Mike responds with, there are veils that are smaller in size that can be cast by less talented casters. Smaller things on their own are also less targeted. Towns and cities need majorly powerful veils because they are like bright lights to a moth. Dalton asks, are there any desolate heartbreak moments in the book, like a major defeat for Sam or something similar? Mike responds with, I've cried a few times writing it. There's always a choice about what parts of the spectrum you want a story to impart. You want to cover a large portion of the spectrum because you want the story to be somewhat realistic, but does that mean I have to include a sex scene in it? No, of course not. You could say the same thing about important topics. Like some people will say I should be more strong-footed in imparting a message about environmentalism, political ideas, etc. Sometimes a story can just be a story. A really well-written story, in my opinion, is separate from the author, and therefore meaning behind certain things is open to interpretation. For instance, if you knew my politics, you would read into every line from the perspective of that my politics were flooding into how the story is written. That takes a lot of fun out of it. Rico asks, are you planning to put an end to the story, or does it just keep going forever? Mike says, there's an end to my part in telling the story. And that's part of what he told us at MetaZoo Hour last week, was that there would come a part where he would be finished writing the main story, and then he would allow other people to start continuing it like an extended universe. Fane asks, is there a motivation driving the dark forces that seem to be antagonists driving the plot's conflict? Mike says, does evil need a reason to exist? Most evil in the world is without reason, and is just an expression of desire. Most well-reasoned evil, if you were to ask its creator, they would very rarely see them or their motivations as evil. Evil just being a thing is scarier. Fane responds with, I wouldn't say evil needs a reason to exist, but it is often rooted in pain, loss, and reactions to others' stigma. The existence of evil creatures made me wonder of their origins. Not that there has to be any one reason. We often see the forces of evil as a dehumanized, faceless entity. Mike responds with, I will say it's interesting that many modern cryptids are scary/evil entities. I think this is a reflection on humankind, though. Rico says, what is Ben B, his role in the lore? Saw him pop up and I'm curious. Mike responds with, you'll have to wait until chapter 9. The next question was, is there an in-lore prism beam equivalent where you can mess up someone's spellcasting or make it easier? Mike responded with, disrupting someone's aura is possible if you are tethered to it somehow and can overpower it. Sky then asked, what do beasties eat? Do they eat people or hodagos? I'm guessing there's also a new medical branch for beasties as well, or no? Mike says, various based on the beasties. Dingbell subsists off a variety of nuts and bolts, or so as far as Sam can tell. There is certainly entire fields of study dedicated to beasties and studying them, containing them, controlling them, cooperating with them, etc. That screams SCP to me. Like, the way that he worded that, the way that he said that, containing them and studying them and controlling them and cooperating with them, that just screamed SCP to me. Demon Fergus asks, how well is the world handling the veil being shattered, or is this still in the rumor stage where everyone is skeptical that these creatures of legend are in fact real? Mike says, beyond the shadow of a doubt, everyone accepts the existence of beasties. There are still mysteries in the world though, namely if every creature/entity encountered can simply be categorized as a beastie, or if other categories need to be defined. Pellety asks, will MetaZoo be focused only on Earth, or will we be going to other worlds? Mike responds with, there are more worlds than these. They don't even have to be very far away, these other worlds. We saw that with what was hidden by the veil. Now this gave me a lot of really cool ideas that I want to work on a theory for, because that, honestly, if you read into that, that tells us a lot of information. Rico then asks, how will cryptids measure their HP? Can they die? And how do they restore power once beaten? Mike responds with, it's very hard for beasties to die. Many fearsome critters almost perished in this way before MetaZoo brought them back to life by adding them to our TCG. Now again, going back to the idea that thought is power, remembrance is power, that seemed like a nice little Easter egg Mike was giving us about that some of these fearsome critters were forgotten until MetaZoo brought the TCG into existence, which then gave those creatures, those fearsome critters, existence because of our belief in them. Now this last question was super awesome. Rico says, how does a caster keep the beasties under control when he is fatigued or sleeping? Mike responds with, the aura used in contracts is separate than that which is available for casting. If you use 20% of your aura to form contracts, your aura naturally shifts to use the remaining 80% that's free. Exhausting that 80% would still leave the 20% in reserve though. If you then contract a beastie and use that 20% without any backup from the 80%, you burn out. But losing your contracts would be moot because, well, you would be dead. If you exhaust the 20% dedicated to contracting, there's a one-way path that automatically pulls from the 80% reserve. But exhausting your 80% wouldn't result in automatically starting to pull from that 20%. He then goes on to say, that's because pouring the 80% of your own pure aura into the 20% reserved for contracting is easier than pulling the fused aura that's part of the 20% of the contracting into your own pure aura. The body knows this automatically, by the way, in the same way it knows how to breathe without you consciously knowing or forcing it. You are all now aware of your own breath and have to consciously control it, or otherwise it will stop. That's interesting too, because in one of the comics, there's one of the little excerpts, one of the extra parts of it. It actually is a piece of a document that goes on about talking about how the magic is infused into pretty much our DNA. And basically they were trying to figure out a way of explaining how humans were able to manipulate magic, and this piece of this paper actually explains exactly what Mike was just talking about. Rico follows up with, so basically contracting too many strong beasties will result in being weak as a caster and very dependent on your contract of beasties. Unstable build, kind of. And Mike just does a smiley face and says bingo. But that's all you have right there. That was all the questions that were asked during that hour. There is another conversation that Mike and I actually had in the lore thread about 3 or 4 months ago that I want to turn into a video. I haven't had a chance to. It goes more in depth on casting of that, things of that nature. So I'll definitely see if I can find my notes and put that together sometime here over the next week or so. But there was a lot of really good information that we found out from that about how the mechanics of the actual world works, the rules, as Mike was actually talking about. Very important that he actually has those rules and he sticks by those rules. Again, that was something that he was talking about in the interview with me a couple months ago. But I'm super excited to actually get the book sometime soon. I'm really excited now to actually know that it isn't linear like Cryptid Nation through Native. It isn't a linear thing. Like, there could be parts of Nightfall that actually show up right next to Wilderness, that show up next to Native. So I really need to go and I need to look at the cards again. I'm glad I actually have a little bit more time to actually work in this timeline video, because now I'm going to have to completely revamp and rethink the entire thing. But my name is Turmentic. Thanks so much for checking out this breakdown of, I don't know, what would you call this? The Lore MetaZoo hour, in essence. But thanks for checking out the breakdown. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful day.